Hello, my name is Glenn Miles. I'm going to present today to you Where Are the Boys? The Missing Agenda. I'm very privileged to be here, part of the Sexuality and Social Work conference, online conference in November 2020. So in each culture, there are stereotypes for masculinity which influence behavior, attitudes, beliefs, and values surrounding male vulnerability. This is what I saw recently in a shop that was close to where I live in Wales in the UK. On one side, you have boys' rules. No girls are allowed. They must play games, use their imagination, climb trees, be brave, build a fort, hunt for treasure, tell jokes, have fun and get dirty, and be adventurers, have adventures. And for girls, no boys are allowed. They must dance like a ballerina. They must sing songs, play dress up, paint their nails, believe in fairies, bake cupcakes, dream big, play pretend, read fairy tales, have tea parties, and laugh often. Isn't it interesting how these persist, these gender roles persist in 2020 that you would think would have we really should have dispensed with now since 1950. This is a Cambodian proverb, and it's not uncommon to have proverbs similar like this around the world. A girl is like a piece of fine linen. If it's stained, then it's spoiled forever. But a boy is like a piece of pure gold. If it's dropped in the mud, then it can easily be washed clean again. Now, the challenge with this proverb is that even though it is very hard on girls, and nobody's denying that it's very difficult for girls in a culture like this, where if they are sexually abused or exploited, it's as if they cannot change. Everything's ruined. Their life is over. But for a boy, it appears that they do much better because they're seen as pure gold. But if you look at it a little bit more depth, you realize that for boys, it's very difficult. They have to get themselves up, brush off. They got to forget about those things that have happened to them. It's all about resilience and nothing about vulnerability. If we look at some of the ancient stories written hundreds of years ago, that are still being passed down now and being shown by Disney. You have these stories, for example, of Sleeping Beauty. She's so vulnerable that she's asleep. She can do nothing for herself. She has no agency. She's just waiting for the handsome prince to come and rescue her. In contrast is Aladdin. He's the boy about town. He's fine. Whatever happens to him, he's going to be fine. Everybody loves Aladdin, but the challenge is that he's all about resilience and nothing about vulnerability. So when genders are compared, boys are seen as strong, resilient, able to survive in difficult circumstances thrown at them, and girls are seen as fragile, vulnerable, in need of protection and with little agency. If we compare girls and boys, the Fourth World Congress on Women in 1996 in Beijing, which is a very significant and important conference, said that girls are more vulnerable than boys to all kinds of violence, including rape, sexual abuse and exploitation, trafficking and forced labor. They didn't always have much evidence to back that up, comparing girls with boys. And I feel quite concerned about that. In my PhD research, I conducted a national survey in Cambodia, which is where I spent most of my adult career. And boys reported more violence than girls in every category, including sexual abuse, rape, witness of rape, and child sale. And also things like physical punishment by parents, bullying, and physical punishment by teachers. So what happens is we tend to see what we expect to see. So what are we looking for? Well, in a review of 166 scholarly articles on the global sex industry, 84% exclusively discussed female sex workers and made no mention of males. 79% simply assume that sex workers are always female. So when males were mentioned, the description was often sex worker, which meant that it implies that they have agency. And the chief danger was HIV. Now, this is very concerning because if the focus becomes HIV, then the concern is more about how HIV gets out into the community rather than that these are males, these are individual people who need our help and support. That they have agency, but they also have vulnerability. And for females, the descriptions are that they're prostituted, which means that they don't have agency, that they're forced to do it. And the chief danger was seen as violence. So in the research that we did in Cambodia, 18.9% of boys aged 12 to 15 said that they'd been sexually touched on the genitals by an adult since they were 9 years old. So what about boys as victims of sexual abuse? Well, globally, 1 in 6 males are sexually abused before the age of 18. Now, this is based on international research, and there is actually a website called 1 in 6, which you can look at and get information about this and from different studies that have been done. So men and boys are sexually exploited, but culturally men and boys are not seen as vulnerable. And the statistics may not be as diverse as we think. So it's pretty much understood that 1 in 4 girls are sexually abused compared to 1 in 6 boys. Emphasis on the girl child. One of the recent foci of the UN has been the girl child. Feminists have welcomed the attention and donors have developed selection criteria that focus on girls. International NGOs have developed policies and programs for girls. The problem is that if you do have research or policy and programs and you say in the selection criteria for research or for programs, you're asking for, it has to be for girls and women, then boys don't get a look in, and the boys need, and boys and young men who are sexually abused and exploited need support. This was a research that was conducted in Cambodia, and it was described as commercial sexual exploitation of children in Cambodia. But in fact, it wasn't commercial sexual exploitation of children, it was commercial sexual exploitation of girls and not children. Now, the problem with that is that the assumption is that somehow boys are being cared for, or boys are in the report somewhere, but it's actually not true. And so then boys get neglected and research isn't done with them. I mean, why couldn't they just have called it commercial sexual exploitation of girls? Similarly, research that's been conducted by UNICEF, the Violence Against Children research, which has been done across Asia, many of the reports are like this one, the report for the Philippines. Now, in this report, they have, if you read the fine print and you actually look at the statistics, boys have a significant amount of sexual abuse and violence experienced. But the way that the report is written, the focus is almost entirely on recommendations for girls and what we need to do to help girls and support girls. And when boys are mentioned, the focus is on what we need to do to get boys to be less violent towards women and girls. Very biased. So what is the current prevailing understanding of trafficking and exploitation? Well, it tends to hinge on stereotypical constructions of the social roles of men and women. Predator versus prey. Sex is a male right and entitlement. Women and girls are sexualized commodities functional to that male right. As a result of this emphasis, there are hundreds of NGOs dedicated to rescuing and helping girls and women, but only a handful, literally, dedicated to assisting boys. If you type into Google human trafficking victim, this is what you can come up with. You come up with a series of pictures, mostly of girls looking vulnerable, sometimes injured, sometimes in chains, and the focus is always, again, on girls. In this BBC Wales report, this was a research that was conducted in Swansea, which is the University of Swansea, which is very close to where I live. And this report was about how students turn to sex work to make ends meet, to be able to pay for their fees and for other things that they need. Although only a third of those research were men, of those taking part in the survey, 5% said they were involved in sex work, compared to nearly 3.5% of the women. Now, if you look at that picture, never mind the ethics of having pictures of potentially vulnerable people, but if you look at that picture, it's all women, no men. And so the assumption is, unless you read the fine print, that sex work, student sex work, is primarily conducted by women, which is not. A 2008 study estimated that as high as 50% of commercially sexually exploited children in the US are boys. So what are some of the misconceptions about sexual exploitation of boys? Well, boys are seen as sexual objects and are not targets of sexual exploiters. Sexual exploitation of boys is perpetuated only by men of homosexual orientation, which is wrong. Exploiters are mostly foreigners. That's not true. Boys consent to have sex with women and therefore are not victims when women are buyers. Sexual exploitation of boys is limited to more open societies. Not true. And the magnitude of the problem is small. Well, we don't really know because there's not enough sufficient research to find out, but I would suggest it's not small. So males are seen as having more agency and more choice. So we looked a little bit before about the research that was done looking at different articles published in social science journals. In that study, it shows that that male sex workers were assigned considerably more agency than female sex workers. So are boys and men victims or oppressors? Well, men are more likely to be victims of violent crime, in fact, and yet they resist the label of victim. Men are conceptualized as the sexual aggressor. In research that we've done with street children, often even the boys who experience violence themselves feel that girls are more vulnerable than them. So these are some of the misconceptions. Whether we like it or not, these common misconceptions and others are impacting the finding of our research. So there's impact on the researcher. Research often views males in the sex industry as liability for sexual health rather than vulnerable human beings that are at risk of violence, stigma, and abuse. And the impact on the respondents is that male victims of females are often viewed as lucky. So, for example, if you have a situation, try and picture a situation in a high school where you have a female teacher who abuses a 16-year-old boy and a male teacher who abuses a 16-year-old girl. In nearly all circumstances, it's the male teacher who experiences the worst in terms of prosecution and the way it's dealt with. Often the boy who has been abused by a female teacher is just seen as lucky. He's seen as, oh, he's managed to get sex from that teacher, rather than it's the teacher that's been actually exploiting the boy. Obviously, that's completely inappropriate, and we need to address those differences. Why are commercially sexually exploited boys so frequently ignored? Well, the willingness of boys to self-identify as sexually exploited due to shame and stigma about being gay or being perceived as gay by family and community is very serious and concerning. Girls are afraid to report being sexually abused or exploited as well, and that they have other reasons why that happens to them. But boys have these particular concerns. There's also a lack of screening and intake by law enforcement and social services agencies rooted in the belief that boys are not victims of commercial sexual exploitation. There's limited outreach by anti-trafficking organisations to areas, venues and tracks known for male prostitution. The focus is nearly always on female. And there's oversimplification of the reality that boys are not generally pimped, and that hides their needs and misinformed. There's also lack of potential services as well for boys and young men. Social service third sector providers must examine why they tend to ignore male sexual exploitation, how these attitudes lead to exploitation, and how sexual abuse affects young men later in life. Boys tend to enter into prostitution either as a means of escaping abuse at home or as a result of early life experiences that lead them to prostitution. That's Lily White and Skidmore. So what research have we been able to do? Well, we started with research listening to young men who were most visible in the massage industry in Phnom Penh, Mumbai, Chiang Mai and Manila. Then we looked at street boys in cities, border areas and beaches who tend to provide sex services for locals, but also for sex tourists as well. And we went to Kampong Som in Cambodia, Manila in the Philippines, Bangkok in Thailand, and Poi Phet in Cambodia, and also more recently Phnom Penh. As well as more straight and gay young men, we discovered transgender women exceedingly at risk, and we did research in Bangkok, Phnom Penh, and hoping to do in Manila. Sexual exploitation can happen to anyone, irrespective of gender, age, ethnicity, and ability disability. In Cambodia, we found that there were children who were deaf, who were being used, sexually exploited, and that the reason why was because they wouldn't be able to report if something happened to them, and so they were even more vulnerable than the other children. We've come to realize how selective the abolitionist movement has been in focusing only on girls. Now, we have developed a training program for children. It's called the Good Touch, Bad Touch Flipchart.org. And we have different versions of it available in Asian and African. And there's interest at the moment in producing a version for the Arabic community and also for the Romani community in Europe. So if anyone's interested in that, please contact me. And the idea is it normalizes the idea that boys and girls can both be sexually abused and exploited. It's not just girls. So what are the implications for social work practice? Social workers need to challenge those who are not recognizing the seriousness of excluding boys and young men, including donors, policymakers, and program designers. Programs that meet the particular needs of sexually exploited boys and young men are needed. Now, another gap is that I just want to look at briefly to finish up, is that the major development agencies who actually develop the policies and decide on how funding is going to be made, they have greater funds, wider influence. They create and sustain the conversation on vulnerability, but the problem is that they're removed from the communities and vulnerable people groups. They have an indirect secondary understanding of vulnerable groups. The problem is that then there's this big gap between them and the grassroots organizations. So the small donors and the deep local influence, they have very little voice in the larger conversation of vulnerability. They deeply invested in real people and communities and direct first-hand understanding of vulnerable groups, but they don't have access to, they're not heard by the people in the major development agencies often. And the problem is that when the UN and tip offices and embassies and governments are writing the reports, they don't often listen to the people at the grassroots level. And so women and girls get the focus of attention because that's what they want, but they're not even really asking about boys because they're not really aware. So it's this kind of circle of disinformation, really. So I want to thank you very much for seeing me and for looking at this program. If you're interested, then please do contact us. This is our contact details. jarrett.d.davis at gmail.com. He's based in New York, USA. And then Dr. Glenn Miles, drglennmiles at gmail.com. And I'm based in Wales in the UK. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope that was of interest to you, and I look forward to hearing more from you. Bye-bye for now.